Great to serve you and bringing you breaking news and politics and more this hour. Thank you so much for watching Outnumbered Overtime. My handle across the pages, and I'm going to be live online shortly. See you there.
A Fox News alert, the White House briefing set to begin in 30 minutes, and many hot topics today, including the president saying the mission to eliminate ISIS in Syria is coming to a rapid end. Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Daily Briefing. The leaders of Russia, Iran, and Turkey meeting to discuss the situation in Syria today. And first on the Daily Briefing, Scott Pruitt defending several of his controversial moves involving taxpayer dollars. Ed Henry standing by with that exclusive interview that got quite feisty. But we start with national security correspondent Jennifer Griffin. Jennifer, what is the reaction from the Pentagon to President Trump saying he'd like to pull all the troops out of Syria?
Well, Dana, it seems as if there may have been a compromise after the president met with his national security team for much of yesterday. And now the White House is saying the president plans to keep U.S. troops in Syria until ISIS is defeated, which it is not. Critics say a pullout would lead to ISIS 3.0. Remember, that is exactly what President Trump criticized President Obama for doing, pulling out prematurely from Iraq, which led to the rise of ISIS. Critics say this would also be a big win for Russia and Iran. President Putin and Iran's president are both in Turkey today to talk about their next steps in Syria. The White House statement on the future of those 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria comes just 2 days before the one-year anniversary of the U.S. Navy's cruise missile strike against that Syrian regime airbase following President Assad's chemical weapons attack against civilians using sarin nerve gas. Dana?
You're certainly busy over there at the Pentagon. And I wanted to also ask you about the president's plan to send U.S. troops to the border with Mexico. Is there any update on that?
Well, the Pentagon says it is still consulting with the White House on its next steps to strengthen the border. Many Pentagon officials were caught off guard by President Trump's comments yesterday, and the Pentagon finally issued a statement this morning, quote, "There are a number of ways the Department of Defense is already supporting the DHS border security mission. We are still in consultation with the White House about ways we can expand that support." President Trump wants the U.S. military to deploy troops along the Mexican border to protect the nation until a wall is in place. He said he's spoken with Defense Secretary Mattis about the idea and called the plan a, quote, big step. President George W. Bush sent 6,000 National Guard troops to the border in 2006. President Obama sent 1,200 in 2010. Previous presidents have worked with state governors to deploy troops at the border. That may be a problem, Dana, in California, where Democrat Jerry Brown has already said he would resist the order. Dana?
That's interesting. Geopolitical issue there. All right, Jennifer, thank you. And now a Fox News exclusive. EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt firing back against critics as he fights to carry out President Trump's agenda. Political opponents are calling for his resignation over ethical issues. Pruitt granting an exclusive interview to Fox News. Chief National Correspondent Ed Henry is here with us, and you had the exclusive. Ed, what happened?
Well, Dana, what's interesting is Scott Pruitt is fighting back. He's telling me the left is attacking him for carrying out President Trump's agenda, and he has been so successful at cutting EPA regulations. Pruitt says it has not just stimulated the economy, but also saved taxpayers what he says is about $1 billion. The first problem with that, though, is some Republicans are now calling on him to be fired. So it's not just the left. And second problem is he's under fire for allegedly wasting all kinds of taxpayer money, too. A report that Pruitt went to the White House last month and demanded big pay raises for 2 aides. The White House said, no, this is not a good use of taxpayer money. Pruitt allegedly ignored that White House directive and gave out the pay raises anyway. Pruitt now claiming to me he was in the dark about the whole thing. It got a little combative.
Now, if you're committed to the Trump agenda, why did you go around the president and the White House to give pay raises to 2 staffers?
I did not. My staff did, and I found out about that yesterday, and I changed it.
So,
PPO process should have been respected, and I issued a statement yesterday walking back those pay raises that should not have been done.
Being fired for that?
That should not have been done. And
so who did it?
It may be there would be some accountability.
A career person or a political person?
I'll have to. I don't know. I don't know.
You don't know. You run the
agency.
agency. You don't know who did this.
I found out about this yesterday, and I corrected the action. So and we are in the process of finding out how it took place and correcting it going forward.
Both of these staffers who got these large pay raises are friends of yours, I believe, from Oklahoma, right?
They are staffers here in the agency.
Then they're friends of yours.
Well, they serve a very important person.
And you didn't know that they got these large pay raises?
I did not know that they got the pay raises until yesterday.
Okay, one of them got a pay raise of, let's see, $28,000. The other was $56,000. Do you know what the median income in this country is?
No, what is it?
$57,000 a year.
Okay.
So one of your friends from Oklahoma got a pay raise that's the medium income.
They did not get a pay raise. They did not get a pay raise.
They did.
No, they did
went-
not. They did not. I stopped that yesterday.
So you stopped it.
Yeah.
But are you embarrassed that
It should
you
not have
run this
happened.
agency?
It should not have happened. And the officials that were involved in that process should not have done what they did.
Except The Atlantic claimed yesterday Pruitt and his team filed a formal application for these pay raises when the White House said no. The magazine says Pruitt found a provision of the Safe Drinking Water Act that allowed him to hire up to 30 people without White House approval. So he ordered they get this money. Pruitt now obviously denying any involvement. The White House says they're investigating, Dana.
And last year, Pruitt had some questions raised about private jets for official travel. And now there are questions about some of his living arrangements in Washington.
Yeah, ABC News first reported that last year he was renting a room in a condo from the wife of a lobbyist for $50 a day. Anyone who has lived in Washington knows that's below market. Plus, renting from the wife of a lobbyist, Pruitt, it seems questionable. Pruitt tried to tell me the lobbyist had no business before the EPA, except one of their clients has been ExxonMobil, which is obviously a company with a lot before the EPA. This runs counter to the president vowing to drain the swamp, which is why two Republicans yesterday called on him to resign or be fired. Congressman Carlos Curbelo saying Pruitt's, quote, corruption is an embarrassment. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen saying she's tired of, quote, scandals and distractions. There's only one opinion, though, that matters. That's of the president. Pruitt says he got a call 2 nights ago and basically got a vote of confidence. But the president has done that before and then fired someone. We'll have a lot more of the interview tonight, 7 o'clock with Martha. Dana?
And I'm sure that well, his office, sent me a note noting that you were going to be on. Their office saying that there was a career senior counsel for ethics who approved the living arrangement. So we'll see.
Except they approved it after he moved out. They approved it a couple of weeks ago, not before he moved in. That's interesting.
So you'll be on Martha McCallum's show tonight at 7 p.m.
We'll have a lot more sound. Thanks
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for that first exclusive look. Appreciate it. So as the special counsel continues its work, a source tells Fox News Robert Mueller informed attorneys for the president that while Trump remains under investigation, he is not a criminal target in the probe. Let's bring in James Trusty, a former DOJ prosecutor, who can help us understand what is this distinction between a subject and a target.
Dana, it's a really small one. The good news if you're an attorney representing someone is if the government calls them a witness. Then you pretty much know you're out of the woods, they're not going to get charged. The worst news is they say it's a target. If they tell you it's a target, effectively you're a putative defendant. It means the prosecutor believes there's substantial evidence of criminal wrongdoing and you should expect to get charged. The vast middle ground there is called subject, and it's kind of a whole lot of nothing when it comes to satisfaction. A subject means your conduct is being investigated. You very easily could end up being a target. You could be charged from that subject status, or you might skate by and be considered a witness someday. But it's definitely nothing to immediately celebrate being called a subject.
Well, and it's not necessarily anything to immediately worry about either, right? Because to me, if it's a distinction with that thin of a difference, then really there was probably nothing new that we learned yesterday from that.
I think everyone would agree that President Trump was at least a subject.
Right.
It would have been probably more surprising if they said target to really confirm kind of the worst fears the administration might have.
Right.
But again, a subject could be charged in a heartbeat. A subject could consent to an interview and get charged 1 minute after the interview concludes. So there's no safety there.
Jeffrey Toobin was on CNN last night, and he was talking about one of the key targets, and indeed somebody who has been charged, Paul Manafort, and whether or not he is getting into a situation where he might actually flip against the president. Listen to this.
I think Manafort's in desperate trouble, and Mueller's response not only was persuasive on the grounds of whether he has jurisdiction to bring the case, but there was another part of the filing that was particularly interesting. One of the big talking points that the president and his supporters have made is that collusion is not a crime. Colluding doesn't violate U.S. laws. But the memo from Rosenstein says very clearly that there can be collusion that is a crime.
Mr. Trusty, let me have you start with Manafort. Is there any reason to believe, or any, besides maybe possibly other information that Toobin has that we don't necessarily, that Manafort is close to flipping on the president?
Right. If Toobin has some sort of insider that's whispering in his ear, here it comes. then that's one thing. But there shouldn't be any big surprises on a couple of fronts. First, that Gates is cooperating, which was part of Toobin's analysis. Any attorney representing Manafort should have had that conversation on day one. What does Gates have? What will he say that hurts you? Assume he's going to cooperate with the government, and then it eventually came true. So I don't know that there's a big surprise there. The motion to dismiss the case for kind of lack of authority for the independent counsel was always a Hail Mary, whether it was filed civilly, which is even more of a Hail Mary, or criminally. That was pretty much going nowhere from the beginning because Rod Rosenstein had already publicly said, essentially, I've given permission to expand the investigation, which he can do under the statute. So I don't think any of that's a big surprise.
You've explained to us before the plain view concept, where that if you start to investigate something and you see something that Manafort has done when it comes to, for example, one of the charges is money laundering, you have the right to charge him for that.
Right. I mean, if the investigation is looking at, some sort of collusion during the Russian campaign and they find evidence of other wrongdoing that results from activities in Ukraine and Russia, they don't have to ignore it. They can actually, they can get the permission slip they apparently got and pursue it and bring Manafort under the jurisdiction of the court.
We have about 30 seconds left, and I wonder if you could just expand on what Toobin was saying there. There seems to be a debate going back and forth about collusion, with one group of lawyers saying collusion is not a crime, and now you have Toobin saying, well, the Department of Justice says that some collusion could be a crime.
Yeah, it's really shocking that lawyers would disagree on something. That's newsworthy in itself. But the reality is collusion is a shorthand word. There's not a crime called collusion, so everybody's kind of right and wrong at the same time. The issue is whether there was conspiracy or concerted activity to violate various federal statutes, and that's a narrower, more precise, more legalistic exercise than just using the shorthand of collusion. So they're kind of both right and both wrong. All
right, well, that's like having a three-handed economist. On the one hand, on the other hand, and yet on another hand. James Trusty, everyone follow him at Trusty Lawyer on Twitter. Thank you. New China tariffs sending the Dow tumbling over 500 points at the opening bell. So just how important are soybeans to rural America, and why is China targeting them? We'll explain. Plus, today's White House briefing set to begin at the bottom of the hour. We'll take you there as soon as it gets underway. Fox News alert: China taking aim at more American products as a potential trade war between the countries escalates. China today announcing new 25% tariffs on imports of soybeans and certain aircraft. The tariffs had stocks down big in overnight trading. Before right now, it's just about even, which has come back up. Joining me now is Fox Business Network's Deirdre Bolton. So one of the things that there was a dispute about today, President Trump tweeting, we're not actually in a trade war, and people saying, well, actually, we don't know.
It feels an awful like what?
Is it like a skirmish?
Yeah, it's like a skirmish. All the rugby fans are going to go, woo.
Yeah.
Right, so the president says we're not, and actually Beijing says we're not either, which is kind of interesting. They say, oh, they kind of imply we're just leveling the playing field so that we're all on the same page. And now this is paving the way to a truce. So most American industries that are affected are saying, okay, fine, but could you at least both sit at the same table and let's hammer this out? So I think there's a deadline, May 22nd, if I'm not mistaken, and then the U.S. government has about 180 days after that to just figure out what goes where. So at this moment, it's one side yelling, the other side yelling, looking tough, and then hopefully going to sit down together and find something in the middle.
But if you're a soybean farmer, you feel like you're in the middle of a war?
Yeah, you do. It's not often that we get to talk about soybean futures.
I love the farmers and soybeans.
Yeah, this morning down 3%. So this is the largest agri-export that the U.S. makes to China. In 2016, it was about $14 billion worth of business. China's also, this is not their first time, right? So they are picking areas also that voted for President Trump. The Midwest is really a very heavy soybean area, big growers there. So the fact that they picked soybeans, I think, is very emblematic. They also picked autos, they picked chemicals, they picked aircraft. They picked things that we really actually care about that would really hurt our economy.
A quick last question is, if they come to the table and there's a truce, will China come to the table and say, all right, we understand the intellectual property issue of your technology is a problem and we are committed to do something about it?
It's unlikely they will say that. I think what most strategists say is that the U.S. can just block Chinese investment quietly in U.S. tech, at least on our shores, and that's a first good sort of strategic move that also doesn't hurt other industries.
All right. Deirdre Bolton, I'm also glad you're here. Glad you're here to hold my hand through it all. Thank you. All right, we are just minutes away from the White House press briefing, and we're going to take you there as soon as it starts. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker warning Republicans of a potential blue wave in November. What prompted him to sound the alarm? We'll tell you all about it. And big news here on the Daily Briefing. I will sit down with Facebook Chief Operating Officer Sheryl Sandberg Friday for a Fox exclusive from the company's headquarters in California. Sandberg will have new details on steps the company is taking to protect your information if you're on Facebook. And I'll ask her about the main event next week, Mark Zuckerberg's testimony before Congress. You don't want to miss that interview. That's on Friday. Here's a live look at Memphis, Tennessee, where thousands are gathered to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today marks 50 years since Dr. King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel. And in our nation's capital this morning, people gathering at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial for a prayer service. So a strong turnout by liberal voters in Wisconsin sending their candidate to the state Supreme Court. Republican Governor Scott Walker sounding the alarm on Twitter. Tonight's results show we are at risk of a blue wave in Wisconsin. The far left is driven by anger and hatred. We must counter it with optimism and organization. Let's share our positive story with voters and win in November. Joining me now, Matt Schlapp is chairman of the American Conservative Union. Ty Matsdorf was deputy executive director for the 2016 Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Matt, I'll start with you. Last night, when you're looking at some of these state-based races, a state Supreme Court election wouldn't necessarily make it to the Daily Briefing show, but it did because of what Scott Walker said and his worry. And let me show you what Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, said about midterm elections. We know the wind is going to be in our face. We don't know whether it's going to be a Category 3, 4, or 5. And, when Hurricane Katrina hit land, it was a Category 3. What do you think?
I don't blame these Republican leaders for sounding the alarm. It's a good thing to make sure that we don't get complacent. You win the presidency, and a lot of times it's hard to put that coalition back together in these races. Look in Wisconsin, Dana, where you have turnout at about 20%. So it's not like you're replicating the dynamics of 2016 in Wisconsin. Remember, we didn't win that at the presidential level before Donald Trump since 1984. It's a very difficult statewide. And finally, the Republican Party never did so much winning than Barack Obama was president. And we have to expect that if the Democrats field better candidates, and they did in Wisconsin, and they did in Pennsylvania 18, and if they raise more money, which they have in a couple of these special elections, you can't expect Donald Trump and the Republican national apparatus to pull you over the finish line. You're going to have to do that yourself. So you got to focus on these fundamentals in order to be successful.
Ty, I imagine you might agree with what Matt just said. I think that you might disagree with what Governor Walker said, is that the Democrats are being fueled by anger and hatred. Is that really what's getting Democrats to the polls?
No, I think that what's getting them in the polls is the passion that they feel about the Trump presidency. Look, whether it's good or bad for the country, more Americans can name the three stooges than the three branches of government. And so what most Americans think of with the government is Donald Trump. And every time they go to the ballot box from now till 2018, that's what's going to be driving them. And for Democrats, they see a presidency that's assaulting their values, assaulting what they see as sort of the democratic pillars of our country. So of course that's going to be a motivator.
Let me turn to the state of Texas, because Democrats have been saying for years that they're going to make it competitive. And Senator Ted Cruz launched his re-election campaign yesterday, Matt, and this comes on a day when Beto O'Rourke, the congressman from El Paso, he's a Democrat running against Ted Cruz, announced that he had raised $6.7 million in the first quarter. And Ted Cruz said this: "That's a whole lot of money. There's no doubt about that. And it has been clear for some time that the hard left is energized and they're mobilized and they're angry at the president. And we are seeing all across the country the far left giving millions of dollars to liberal Democrats running for office. And it underscores that Republicans cannot take November for granted." And yet, Matt, when the primary was held, Ted Cruz in the primary received more votes than all of the Democrats combined, 1.3 million votes. And so I just wonder here, what's going on? Are Democrats wasting their money?
Look, I think the Democrats feel like they have some momentum on their side. They've had a couple of victories in these specials, although Republicans have had a lot more. They obviously hate Ted Cruz because he stands for every conservative value there is. And there's this myth that Texas is about ready to flip, which they are many years away from the demographic trend that they think is going to be realized. So if you look at it all in totality, Republicans can't get cocky. Ted Cruz was very measured in his statement, but there is not one single fundamental dynamic in Texas that points to a Ted Cruz loss other than Hollywood and New York is doubling down on Beto O'Rourke. And I think that's a pretty good message for Ted Cruz.
But Ty, is Beto O'Rourke one of those different types of candidates like Matt was saying about Conor Lamb in Pennsylvania? Is he just younger and different enough that he might get some sort of attention from the Democratic Party that maybe a Texas Democrat might not have gotten before?
Well, I think he's probably the only candidate that we're fielding whose resume includes rock band member. But look, he is igniting a passion. Matt is right. The Democratic Party has long viewed Ted Cruz quite hostily. And the thing about Beto O'Rourke is all his money is coming in small dollar donations. So we call that a renewable resource. So he can continue to put up these money.
This is not accurate. Ted Cruz actually gets more smaller dollar donations than Beto O'Rourke, and Beto O'Rourke is getting a lot of these contributions from out of the state. So I actually think it doesn't help you much make your grassroots argument in Texas.
I don't have the breakdown of where the money came from, but Ty, I'll give you the last word.
On Texas, Matt's right. Like, I spent the last week with one of the smartest Texas pollsters I know, and it's going to be an uphill climb. It's also an expensive state. Look, $6.7 million in a state like Wyoming. You could take everybody out to Red Lobster. Run a Senate race in Texas is quite expensive. So it's still going to be an uphill climb.
I'm from Wyoming, and I don't even know if they still do. They have a Red Lobster? Maybe
they got it.
They have red something, but it's not lobster.
Well, it's certainly a red state. All right, Matt Schlapp and Ty Matsdorf, thank you. Reporters standing by at the White House, and we are minutes away from today's briefing. We'll take you there live. Plus, the path to a Democratic congressional majority could hinge on whether Republican members in otherwise safe seats blow winnable races. Josh Kroshar will tell us about the House GOP slackers.
When someone watches the news, they want someone they can trust. Our job is to cut through the talking points.
We're going to ask the tough questions because there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there that needs to be challenged.
What I'm doing is making sure that whatever is developed through the day, people are fully informed from coast to coast.
We're 24/7 news, but we're really down to the minute.
We're going to be fearless. We're going to be fair.
Whether it's 4 a.m. or midnight, we're there.
We are waiting for the White House briefing to begin, and they could get questions about the new China tariffs targeting things like soybeans, cars, airplanes, and whiskey. Karl Rove is a former White House Deputy Chief of Staff and Fox News contributor. Those are fighting words when you start going after our whiskey, Karl.
By God, you bet. The only thing worse is if they came for our water.
That's right. Well, at least not yet, because apparently both sides, both China and the United States, are trying to calm everybody down, saying this is not a war. I guess that we're like in the run-up to a war because this tariff issue is front and center. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro said when the president announced the tariffs on China that the Chinese would not retaliate, and the next day the Chinese put out a list of 130 products with tariffs of 25%. So
if I could hold you there for 1 second, Karl. I have a quote here from Bloomberg.com saying that China's response was tougher than what the market was expecting. Investors didn't foresee the country levying additional tariffs on sensitive and important products such as soybeans and airplanes, said Guo Qi, Singapore-based strategist at Scotiabank, or Scotiabank, I should call it, if I'm being accurate. So the Chinese are basically being very smart, right, and very strategic. They're trying to look at looking at places where President Trump has a lot of support, but also, you know, soybeans at $14 billion a year as an export. That certainly will feel like you're in a war if you're a soybean farmer.
Well, you're going to feel like it right now. Last night I was at a Republican dinner in Central Ohio and talking to a guy who grows soybeans. And we're about ready to get to the start of growing season. So are you going to put soybeans in the ground? Are you going to put corn in the ground? Or are you going to leave something up for rotation? Last year, he filled everything with soybeans because there was a ready market for it and he couldn't make money on corn. Now he's worried that he might not be able to make money on soybeans. So this is going to cause some discombobulation, even though these are prospective tariffs and won't be laid in until some number of days after, 60 days and then 180 days. So, but it causes confusion, it causes instability, and it could be very dangerous for our economy and the Chinese economy.
And I can see that for the farmers too, because you don't know exactly how much to plant, and plus you have other factors that you can't control, like the weather, and if you have a bad year, you could possibly end up going out of business. So let me also switch gears for a second. I just had Matt Schlapp and Ty Mastorf on talking about some midterm election issues, and we talked about the state of Texas and Ted Cruz, who announced his re-election bid last night. Beto O'Rourke is the congressman from El Paso. He certainly is a different type of campaigner, really trying to do grassroots, raised $6.7 million in the first quarter. That obviously is a ton of money, but Republicans came out in droves to vote for Ted Cruz in the primary, dwarfing the Democratic vote. And I'm just curious what you think from a political standpoint. Is it smart for Democrats to put all this money into Beto O'Rourke when there are lots of other races that they could win that are going to be a lot closer than this one will be?
Well, I think that's a good point. And remember, Beto, he's actually named Robert Francis O'Rourke, but he's adopted the name Beto in order to, he had a heavily Hispanic district in El Paso, so he was trying to appeal to that vote by coming up with a nifty nickname. But Robert Francis O'Rourke spent over $4 million in the Democratic primary, got 62% of the vote. But the two people that ran against him, a man and a woman, a nurse and a retired postal worker, spent between them $800, got 38% of the vote, and carried 103 of the state's 254 counties. So Robert Francis O'Rourke is going to need to spend a lot of money to be competitive in Texas, to make himself known, and to run as a very blue Democrat in a very Republican state. And
yeah, I'm trying to figure out the strategy. I understand why people would want to donate to his campaign, and they're excited, and I know the Democrats have long thought that Texas at one day will be a place where they can be competitive. But this year, it seems to me there's so many competitive races across the country that if Mitch McConnell is saying that we are looking at a category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane in the midterms, why would you put all of that money into Texas? I'll give you the last word.
Well, look. Yeah, look, when it comes to Texas, we got Democrats thinking they're the Ahab, and they got two big white whales. One white whale is turning Texas blue, and the other one is defeating Ted Cruz. And they're like Captain Ahab. They're not going to let the facts and the reality of the situation. You're right. Their dollars would be better spent in places like Nevada or Arizona or even Tennessee, and certainly the 5 states that they've got really at risk, Montana, North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana, and West Virginia, and also potentially Florida and Ohio. They got plenty of places to spend that money, but they're Ahab, and they're after the 2 big white whales.
I like to imagine your brain going through the map of all the different states that you have in your head. All right, Karl Rove, thank you.
Thank you, Dana.
So no room for error. That is how my next guest describes the challenge Republicans are facing in the midterms, and he has singled out 5 lawmakers as the, quote, worst House Republican slackers, saying their lack of preparation could cost the GOP in November. Let's bring in Josh Kraushaar, politics editor for the National Journal. I saw this column this morning. I knew you were going to be on the show, and I thought, bingo, is he writing this just for me so you could appear today and tell us what you know about these 5?
Well, these are 5 members who haven't raised enough money, haven't acted in a political enough way to win their districts, even though they represent pretty Republican districts. And look, there are 23 House seats that Democrats need to win to take back the majority, and there are 25 Republican seats that are ones that Hillary Clinton won in the last election. So there's no margin for error for House Republicans. They can't afford to lose House seats in pretty Republican territory, and they need all the members that should be safe, that should be breezing through a re-election to do what it takes to win another term.
You have on here Representative Pittenger from North Carolina, Claudia Tenney from New York, Dave Bratt of Virginia, who won that surprising race against Eric Cantor just a few years ago, Ted Budd of North Carolina, and then Tim Walberg of Michigan. What are the Republican congressional committees saying about this race? And are they sounding the alarm because they're actually worried, or are they just trying to push them to get out there and campaign a little more?
So first off, the big House super PAC, aligned with Paul Ryan, the Congressional Leadership Fund, has basically established an informal bailout fund of at least several $1 million, maybe more money, to help members that aren't on their target list, that aren't on their top list of members they need to help protect. But they're worried that these members aren't doing enough to run strong re-elections, and they may need to save some money to help preserve these seats come October and early November. Claudia Tenney is a good example of someone who really should be in a safe seat. Her district voted for Trump by double digits, but she made a comment after the Florida school shooting saying that all mass shooters are Democrats, got in a lot of trouble, didn't go and talk and explain what she was trying to say. And she's in a district where a Republican, there was a poll that Democrats did that showed a Republican winning pretty easily, but Claudia Tenney is actually losing to one of her leading Democratic challengers, even though Trump won that district pretty comfortably.
Tell me more about Dave Brat from Virginia.
Dave Brat, I mean, he's best known for knocking off Eric Cantor in 2014, but he is a lot more conservative, and he proudly identifies as sort of a Freedom Caucus leader in a district that's becoming more suburban, becoming more diverse in the Richmond area. And Republicans have done some polls that show that this race is very close. I've talked about one of the Democratic challengers running against Dave Brat, a former CIA officer who's one of the Democrats' leading recruits this election year. So Dave Brat can't take, I mean, this is a Republican-leaning seat, but you can't, in a wave year that Democrats may have, you can't take any seat for granted.
And I think that is something that like Corey Bliss from that group that you talked about, one of the things they're saying is just because you've won easily in the past doesn't mean that that is going to be the case this year. And I guess it is hard to figure out if you're going to be overtaken by a wave, how to get out there and try to campaign in a different way.
That's right, Dana. I mean, Republicans, and especially these outside groups, are helping a lot of the members. They're spending tens of millions of dollars and trying to help the most vulnerable members in the most competitive seats. But they really can't afford to protect members who are in districts where Donald Trump did really well.
Right.
They can't afford to spend money in the Republicans' district. So this is like playing a game of whack-a-mole. You know, you think you've protected maybe some of the more vulnerable members, but then you got 10 or 15 other Republicans that aren't doing their due diligence, and you have to worry about them when push comes to shove.
And a last quick word, are there Democrats that are in a similar position that they're not working as hard as they should?
There are a handful, not quite as many. I would point to there's one guy, Cartwright, in Pennsylvania, who's a Democrat in a Trump district who hasn't necessarily voted as conservatively as he should be voting. But look, when you have a blue wave, it tends to put more pressure on the Republicans and not the Democrats.
Indeed, it's that kind of year. All right, Josh Kraushaar, thank you.
Thanks, Dana.
We are just minutes away from today's White House briefing. We'll take you there live. Plus, a pair of Republican congressmen facing off in the Hoosier state, hoping to claim a seat in the Senate. What does it mean for incumbent Democrat Joe Donnelly? We'll tell you.
Shepard Smith on the Fox News deck, expecting the White House press briefing to begin at any minute now, and really where to begin. President Trump says there's no trade war with China, but China is retaliating against the president's planned tariffs. The president also calling for troops at the southern border and saying that he wants our forces out of Syria soon. The White House saying our mission there is coming to a rapid end. We'll try to find out what that means. And we're learning the special counsel, Robert Mueller, told the president's lawyers that President Trump was a subject of the Russia investigation, not a target at the moment. That's all top of the hour. Shepard Smith reporting. We'll see you then.
Take a look at this. Strong winds tearing apart a hangar near Houston's William P. Hobby Airport. 8 planes were damaged, and in eastern Indiana, this road clearly no match for Mother Nature. Severe weather and thunderstorms creating powerful flooding that ripped it apart. Speaking of the Hoosier state, its Senate race is one to watch. Longtime rivals and House Republicans, you've seen them on this show, Luke Messer and Todd Rokita, are going for the seat, but there's some concern they could block each other if the war of words between the two congressmen gets too heated. Peter Doocy is in Indianapolis. Peter, this could open the door for the Democratic incumbent.
Because, Dana, Democrats are essentially hoping to lay low while the Republican candidates for the chance to take on Joe Donnelly are battling it out to see who has supported President Trump the most and for the longest. Congressman Todd Rokita, who in a brand new campaign ad is wearing the very famous red and white Make America Great Again hat, insists that it's him because his competition, Congressman Luke Messer, initially in 2016 donated to Rubio and Bush.
We're a different kettle of fish. He is establishment. The establishment is against me just like they were against Donald Trump. You look at his finance team and you got people on there that were calling Donald Trump unfit to be president.
And we are hoping to get Messer's reaction to that charge in about 20 minutes, but he has been accusing Rokita of making things up about him. Dana.
So, Peter, how is the Democratic Senator Joe Donnelly trying to keep his seat while all of this is going on?
He's actually trying to spotlight or highlight the fact that his voting record has been 62% with President Trump. Now, normally if a lawmaker is going to highlight their voting record, you would get a much higher percentage than 62%. But Donnelly, one of the 10 Democrats trying to win re-election in a state President Trump carried, says that he was fine supporting something like his Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch.
I vote with the president a lot. I don't worry so much about what's being said on Twitter or what's being said on TV. It is, okay, what's going on the ground that we can move the ball forward.
But Donnelly was a no vote on tax reform, and that may have stirred up a very powerful surrogate against him, because President Trump came here in September and said that if Donnelly voted no, he would be back to campaign against him. And since President Trump won here in 2016 by 19 points, that could be a problem for Donnelly.
And not to mention that I'm assuming the vice president, Mike Pence, will probably be making a few campaign stops there as well. All right, Peter.
Right,
Mason,
and remember in 2016. Yep.
Sorry, Peter, I have to go because we are just moments away from a White House briefing. We'll get to that as soon as it starts. Plus, First Lady Nancy Reagan, the subject of a fascinating new book that takes readers behind the scenes during some critical moments at the Reagan White House. We'll talk to the author straight ahead.
Quote.com. Discover what over 1 million families know. We shop, you save.
She's been called one of the most influential first ladies ever, and now a new book is giving an insider account of Nancy Reagan's time in the White House. It's called Lady in Red, an intimate portrait of Nancy Reagan. And joining me now is the author, Sheila Tate, former press secretary to Nancy Reagan, a good friend and certainly a mentor, someone I've looked up to for years. This book must have been a real labor of love for you, Sheila.
It was, but it was also the hardest thing I ever did, Dana.
Why?
Because I felt such a responsibility once I finally decided to do it, to really help provide a more fulsome profile of Nancy Reagan. So many people at her memorial talked to me about how sad they were that more people didn't know her the way we knew her. And as you could probably imagine, after I heard that about 10 times, I thought they were blaming me.
Right, and that you have a responsibility. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. When you feel like you have a responsibility. And another good friend of both of us, Marlon Fitzwater, who was the press secretary for the Reagans, he told a story about a wardrobe malfunction and Mrs. Gorbachev, and he said, I thought at the time that Nancy had done more for U.S.-Russian relations with that one gesture than had been accomplished since the creation of the Soviet Union. Not a lot of people know this story. What was it?
Well, he said it was the first time he'd ever told anybody this story, but there was a particularly freezing cold day, so instead of meeting and greeting them outside of the diplomatic reception room, everybody was crowded inside. And as the Gorbachevs came in, Nancy noticed that Raisa Gorbachev's pantyhose were collapsing.
Yes.
And she quietly slipped right over to her and said, "Come with me." Took her to the ladies' room. They got it all straightened out, and nobody else ever noticed it except Marlon.
Right. Marlon didn't miss anything. It's interesting about first ladies and the role that they play. They get to choose. A lot of what they do, the platforms that they care about, and also the graciousness with which they serve amidst really tough times when their, up to now, husbands have been really maligned in the press by their opponents. Any advice you have from how she handled that?
Well, she decided to concentrate on doing something that she really cared about, and that was to deal with this growing problem of youth drug abuse. And I mean, she was heavily criticized at first. Every first lady is scrutinized so carefully for what they wear, how they behave, and you just have to put that aside and focus on something that where you can really, really achieve something.
I know that people don't necessarily believe that the Just Say No campaign worked on some kids, but I was a young child when they were serving, and it really did work for me. She accomplished a lot. Is there any other little tidbit you could tell us about the book before we have to go?
If you do nothing else, read the last chapter.
Okay.
It's the story of Nancy's last days, and it involves a little dog named Digby. And I think you'll love it.
You know that I'll love it if it's about a dog. Of course I will.
know.
Sheila Tate, I'm so honored that you came on the show, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Some breaking news out of Facebook just now about how many people were affected by the Cambridge Analytica improper data share. They just released this information. We're going to tell you about that right after the break.